I will give a proper introduction in a minute, but before we do that, I just want to set the stage a little bit for everybody that's watching here. COVID has obviously affected healthcare issues, the economy, but there's all these ripple effect issues that are going on too, right? Its tentacles are in all aspects of our lives. And one is domestic violence, sexual abuse, and that's why we have you all on here today to talk about that. So I'm going to just make the quick introduction to everyone. When I say your name, if you don't mind, just give me a little wave so we know who we're looking at here, right? Beth Hamilton, Deputy Director of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Assault. Hi, Beth. Thank you for joining us. Karen Jarma, President and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition to End Domestic Violence. Karen, and then Detective Carrie Dolan, the Fairfield, who works on sex crimes and domestic violence. So again, I appreciate you all joining the call today. So I'm going to just, this question is going to be for all three of you, and we could start with you, Beth, but it's a very general, broad question. So I want your experience, what you're seeing right now. What effects have you seen from COVID now with sexual assault or domestic violence?
So working for the Sexual Assault Coalition, primarily speak to sexual violence. And I think what, we've seen is probably what other folks have seen. And that is that while some of the prevention methods that we're using to combat the virus that are making us less likely to get sick are also creating conditions that are that would increase the perpetration of sexual violence. So things like isolation and social distancing can create really big vulnerabilities for folks who might already be at risk of being unsafe. We know that the closing of schools and daycares and community centers may put children at risk. And, for those folks who have parents who are still going to work, they might be dependent on, caretakers that they might not normally be using. We even know that last month the FBI issued warnings, about the increased risk for child exploitation as schools are moving to distance learning. And we know that things like, unemployment and economic insecurity also, as the CDC states, increase the risk of perpetration. So really what we're seeing is less folks reaching out at a time when we know there's likely even more violence happening within homes and within, settings where folks are currently relegated to. So we've seen folks, for example, students who are reaching out on the campus side who are saying, hey, I was right in the middle of this adjudication process or right in the middle of reporting, and now I'm going home to a home state, for example, where I don't have a lot of support. I don't know that, the service provider's there or have a counselor there. And now I'm doing all this stuff remotely when maybe my parents didn't even know I was sexually assaulted. And so I think some of those ripple effects that you were talking about, that's just one example, but we're sort of seeing that in many realms for survivors. And I think folks have less and less, ability. Maybe that's because we're parenting at home full time, or maybe that's because we're living with folks or caretaking for folks who we weren't with before. But I think generally folks, have less privacy and less ability to sort of reach out at a time when, for survivors, particularly of sexual and domestic violence, they likely are needing that support the most.
Right. Yeah, and Karen, we'll swing over to you too. I mean, you're in a similar world here as Beth. What are you seeing on the front lines here?
Yeah, very similar to what Beth was referring to in terms of we know that due to the COVID experience, it's really important for everyone to stay home, but for victims of domestic violence who may be living with their abusive partner, this creates some really unique challenges. And it also creates challenges within systems. So for example, they may be less likely to reach out to law enforcement, which is an option for fear that their partner might need to leave the home, and they may be dependent upon that person financially and in other ways. And so there's been real concern for how the change in systems, and I think it's something that on the advocacy side, both within I think the Alliance and CCADV that we're working really hard on is concerted outreach to victims at this really critical time, because the systems that are in place to be supportive understandably have shifted. So Connecticut courts have gone from 19 down to 6 with very limited opening hours, right? So we are finding, for example, that there are many victims where their partner is using the COVID experience and also the circumstance where courts are not open, and therefore they can't go in and modify an order where someone is supposed to be seeing their child and they're keeping their child from them. So it's how do we navigate this circumstance where individuals are perhaps shut in with an abusive partner, limited in terms of how they might be able to reach out. It's difficult to find a safe space perhaps to be able to have a conversation with an advocate. You can email, you can chat with an advocate, online, certainly through CT Safe Connect, which is our mechanism to provide support to victims of domestic violence. But that can be a little disconcerting if that person's in the house with you. And then all those other options have changed a little bit, not significantly. They are still there on some level, but it's how are we adjusting in terms of keeping people safe? I think that's been the biggest challenges for our system.
Thank you. And Detective, how about you on your end, on the front lines?
Obviously, 100% agree with everything Beth and Karen just said. You know, I work hand in hand with our local advocacy agencies, and I can say as a positive thing, it's definitely strengthening our relationship, which was already good to begin with, because we're all going through this together for the first time. So it involves a lot of flexibility, trying things that maybe we, you know, wouldn't have previously tried just because it's such a unique circumstance. And I think for the most part, it's working. As far as working with victims, it's been a challenge. You know, as a detective, I do a lot of the follow-up investigations, but sometimes people will reach out to me as an initial report instead of going through patrol. You know, I still have to get a statement, I still have to gather evidence, and that has been a little bit of a challenge. But, you know, like I said before, we're trying different things. I'm doing recorded phone calls when it's safe for the victim to talk to me. I'm gathering evidence in different ways, and, you know, we're doing the best we can. One of the things that Karen mentioned is the fact that right before we started this, I was going through my emails, and, you know, Bridgeport is one of the courthouses that's currently open, but they're only opened 3 days a week now. So Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. And even with that, it's limited hours, and they're taking on the burden of all the other courthouses that are closed. So what that means is I submit a warrant for domestic violence, and this is actually a situation I'm dealing with now. I've waited for almost 2 weeks now for the warrant to come back, which is unheard of. And this particular victim is in the home with the abuser. So, you know, we check in every day. It definitely makes me feel uncomfortable, but, you know, we're working through it.
So I've heard a little bit of a theme going on with the courts having to reduce its hours, availability. So what can the state do better? I mean, and what is the solution, or how should the state be handling this now that there are less court hours? And this can go to anybody that can answer this. Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, on the civil side, it took us about a week. So Carrie, I feel your pain, to work out with the judicial branch the circumstance whereby an executive order was authorized by the governor to allow for online restraining order applications. We understand that's difficult for the judicial branch to comprehend in terms of what that would be in normal times, but these are very abnormal times. And so victims can apply for a restraining order online. We've been directing individuals to ctsafeconnect.org so that they can go through that process. We actually took on the role of working with marshals for service of order for fear of, similar to what Carrie was talking about, how systems are reduced, the communication isn't necessarily what it was. So we felt that if advocates were working with marshals, we could have a better understanding of when that order is provided and delivered. I think the question for us is, how do we prioritize those really critical circumstances where we need to push through these systems and really work collaboratively, knowing that they can't wait. They can't wait 2 weeks. They can't wait 2 days. And how do we work together around those items?
No, I'd love to also, if possible, highlight, another example where I think folks are working really hard to get it right, and I think that, much to Karen's point, everybody, and Carrie's point, folks are really doing the best they can in an unforeseen circumstance, that hopefully coming out of this, we're going to have some real stringent policies and procedures that are going to help us do this should we need to do it in the future. But I think it is really an unknown. And one of the places where sexual assault survivors have also been impacted is going to the hospital to get evidence collected following a sexual assault. And what we've seen significantly is that, in the times when folks are showing up, they have been able to get really great care, even under the circumstances. So even in our hospitals that are incredibly overwhelmed with the COVID-19 response, we've seen places where they've gotten our advocate on the phone if they're not able to let an advocate into the room with that person due to concerns in the hospital with the virus spreading. and they've done an exceptional job. We've also heard from advocates on the other side saying, hey, listen, right now, this survivor is calling the hotline. They're not going to go to the emergency department because they're afraid of, contracting, the virus, and there's some real fears, or the hospital is saying, hey, really think twice about coming in here right now. And so I think, that the other sort of nice thing to highlight is that folks have been able to figure out how to get survivors, the services that they need, how to make those connections with folks like, the police officers who are doing the investigations, the safe healthcare providers who are collecting the evidence, and the hospitals under the most dire of circumstances have really stepped up and done an amazing job with survivors when they are presenting in the emergency department.
Good, thank you for pointing that one out. And with the courts, that's one issue. Another issue, and I'm making an assumption here, so correct me if I'm wrong, but teachers often are first reporters, right? They can see if a child, something doesn't look right, and I think they're mandatory reporters, correct? They have to report if they see it. We no longer have that right now. So what can we do because now with that missing, right? I mean, that means there's going to be less eyes on children. So how do we make up for that?
One of the conversations we've actually had, so I have 2 young children. I have a preschooler and I have a 7-year-old, both of whom are in our local public schools. And we've been in contact with the folks at the school. And one of the things they actually talk about is they do some check-ins with kids. They mandate that the teachers check in once or twice a week, even if it's only for 15 minutes, in part because they want to have eyes on the kids. They want to talk with the families and the caretakers to be able to know that, even if there's nothing else happening in the home, they know that the kids are safe. Parents aren't. And I really feel for parents right now who are trying to homeschool at the same time as take care of all the other things that we're doing. But I think that's why schools are doing some of those distance learning build-ins, check-ins with teachers. Our teachers have done here in West Hartford have done an amazing job of making sure that they're checking in with all of their students, that they are doing it once a week, even if that means that there's multiple calls happening to the families and those kinds of things. And that's another place where I would really highlight that teachers are doing an amazing job, really adapting to circumstances that they have not had to participate in the same ways before. But I think that's one of the reasons that schools are continuing to stay in contact for that very reason, to try to make sure that there is, especially for kids that they have concerns about already, but to make sure there is, an additional adult who is checking in on those children.
Right. Does anybody else want to add to that, or did that cover
I have a 15-year-old and she's in high school. And when this first started, they had, I don't know if it was for everybody or what, but, my daughter had a social worker reach out to her and they spent like 10 or 15 minutes on the phone just talking. Mm-hmm. I thought that was wonderful. And that's here in Stratford.
That's great. I mean, Detective, I'm going to throw this one to you too. So speaking of, what can we do now because we have less eyes, even if there are check-ins, the schools are checking in, I guess I'm going to walk through a character right now. I'm going to just walk through what could be going through some people's minds. I think there might be something going on with my neighbor, my cousin, but I don't want to interfere if there isn't something there. And the system already right now, first responders and police are dealing with enough. This seems more like a personal issue that I just don't know. What if I'm wrong? What would you say to somebody in that situation?
So like I mentioned before, we have such strong partnerships with our advocacy agencies, and that's where that comes into play. I'm a big proponent of community involvement. We can't, especially crimes of domestic and sexual violence, we can't solve them on our own. We have to address these as a community. We always ask people in the community, there's that if you see something, say something, right? But that absolutely applies to domestic violence, where people are sometimes reluctant to get involved because they feel it's not their business. They don't want to be involved. I've had plenty of conversations with people like that. And generally what we would do is refer to the Center for Family Justice here in Bridgeport, because the police is not the right answer for everybody in a domestic violence situation. That's why those partnerships are so important, just for for people in the situation to know that they're definitely not alone. And there's so many people that want to help them. Oftentimes people think law enforcement's going to get involved. Well, that's going to be an arrest. It's going to be public. There could be jail time and lawyer fees and things like that. And those are very real concerns. So that's not the only answer. And we try to, inform people as much as we can. Right. Oftentimes we're the first step, we're the first phone call, but those partnerships are so important.
Thank you.
And
yes.
Just just to build on that, so there's, I think, and Beth can probably attest to this too, there's really unique approaches taking place right now within the advocacy community. I had one of the executive directors of the 18 sites comment to me that there is outreach like never before, right? So there are advocates who are outreaching to victims and survivors in a much more concrete way with concerns around their safety. The other piece of our work we call Bring on the Bystander, and I've been asked this question before a couple of times over the past few weeks. There are options for family members, work colleagues, friends to be able to check in on their loved one or the person they care about to make sure they're okay. Because we know that in the particular case of domestic violence, an element of that is the abusive partner trying to isolate you from those individuals around you who you see as a support. So we are encouraging the victims and survivors, but then also those people around them to reach out, do a FaceTime conversation, have a conversation on the front porch where you're still at a social distance, but physically go over, check on them. How are you doing? Good to see you. Or have a phone conversation, whatever ways that you're able to perhaps let that person know that they don't have to be isolated, that you're there to support them, and if they need you, you're there as well.
Right. So in a lot of ways, even being more aware now that there is an increase, this is intensifying, right? And now if you do suspect it, you should be reaching out to that person because you now might be their only line of defense.
Absolutely. And we can do that. We can do it safely with the ways that I just mentioned. Mm-hmm. And technology is so amazing today. You can do a conversation like we're having right now. You can FaceTime someone. You can go stand on their porch. You could even go for a walk if you stayed at a distance from each other and have conversation and spend some time with them.
It's good. And actually, this is great. So my producer just sent a question here. So I'm going to backtrack to you, Beth, but anybody can answer this because this even goes along with what we were just talking about, Karen. So what are some of the behavioral clues that you can get from a video call? You know, and this was in reference to students, but we could even make it broader. What are some clues that you might be able to pick up on as you're watching somebody, hearing somebody, you know, interacting with those that you're talking to from a distance?
I think some of that, I mean, there are certain strategies I think that would work best for folks that you know, right? So folks like teachers are really tuned into the kids they've already known. They spent, 2/3 of a year with them up to this point. And I think for them, they're able to pick up in, probably changes in some behavioral stuff. But again, that's not a lot of time, right? Spending 15 minutes twice a week with a student is not necessarily a ton of time to pick up on the nuances. And, I'm a parent who stays in the room with my 2 children when they are online at all times at this point, right? So it's not like they're going to have a lot of freedom. I think some of it is being able to sort of have contextual clues and being able to have, conversations that really ask folks about how their lives are doing, ask them how they're feeling, sort of trying to get clues about their circumstance that are not directly asking, not going to make somebody unsafe by saying, is something happening in your home right now in front of the folks who might be perpetrating behaviors that are harming those children, for example. So I think it's really about not necessarily like big key warning signs perhaps, but more the nuance of conversation and really being able to check in with somebody. And again, this is going to work best for folks that you already know. I would really also echo some of the things that both Karen and Carrie said in terms of really one of the things that you can do as sort of a lay person, right? Like we know how to do this in the advocacy community, but if you feel like you are a person who's not an advocate and you want to think about how you do this, is you just think about expanding those circles of care, right? The way we're checking in on our neighbors for food and medicine, the ways that we can start to think about providing distractions, right? So showing up, there was an adult survivor of childhood sexual abuse recently online who said, here are the things I wish somebody did when I was a kid and there was abuse happening in my home. And it was coming over and dropping off puzzles or dropping off cookies for the kids or saying, hey, I noticed you guys, don't have access to this technology. Can I drop off this old iPad? Really trying to draw and build relationships. So part of it is, picking up on the signs if you have an existing relationship, and part of it is trying to develop a relationship with somebody so you can also then pick up on some of those contextual clues to identify if folks are in need of some support or some help.
Right. Detective, do you have anything to add to that? Some cues and clues that you can pick up on when you're talking with somebody?
Just to agree with Beth. We have to reach out and you just look for changes in behavior. I can very clearly remember, I don't know, there's a case of Susan Still, which was a pretty famous case out of New York State. and they interviewed, she was very severely abused, and the children were forced to videotape her abuse. And I remember Oprah Winfrey did an interview with the children afterwards, years after, and one of the children said, you know, watching my father physically abusing my mother was is as normal every day in my house as brushing my teeth. So when you hear a child especially kind of normalizing behaviors that you know are not normal, you know, pick up on that. And, you know, like Beth said, carry on a relationship with that person and try and get them to, you know, to have that conversation with you.
Right. So we've been talking now, this is great, we've been talking about individually what we can do. I'm going to take another step back now and talk again on a macro level here for the state. I mean, I know you're not all in the inner workings of government, but there is going to be increased demand. It's going to get more intense. From what I've been reading too, you know, the more pressure that we have as far as jobs and money and you know, health, everybody's health, that could add to the stresses to you know, the family dynamics. So do you think Connecticut is adequately ready to handle the new intense demand that's about to come with domestic violence and with having to address these issues and being able to, for service to all these victims? Are we ready for this?
Well, you know, I think I've been really impressed with the outreach within various state agencies and systems, Department of Housing, Mental Health and Addiction Services, Department of Social Services, OPM, VOCA, the judicial branch. There has been very concerted outreach how to handle the immediacy of what's going on. And so there are resources that are coming to CCADV and domestic violence organizations to address some of the unique circumstances associated with advocacy and COVID-19. But you raise a really good point, and it's where we're starting to pivot right now is how do we project for the future? Because we know that, as you say, this is not just going to be over in a few weeks or a month where we turn on a light switch and we all go back to normal. There are some very unique considerations, especially around economics and financial instability, and that's going to put pressures on families. And so we've already started to have those conversations with legal advocacy folks and our advocates to understand how we can be better prepared. I think the other side to this is where I'm not sure what is going to happen is financial support from state agencies. There has been no reduction in terms of the resources provided for advocates, but we know that perhaps in the new fiscal year there will be increased need, but yet the same level of advocacy from a resource perspective. And so we're just thinking through that and preparing, and that's where I think the systemic collaboration is just so imperative.
Yeah, I mean, I would echo, you know, everything Karen said, you know, share also that I think similarly, we're using the time to really bolster our responses, to really think through and plan, you know, knowing that we are maybe not as busy as we normally are. We're not all in our offices right now. We're using it as a real opportunity, and our programs are using it as a real opportunity to be able to really strengthen their responses, to be able to identify where are the places where, you know, we can anticipate some of the needs going forward. And then similar to what Karen shared is we're working with, you know, state agencies and other folks at the systemic level to be able to identify what kinds of support folks are going to need that might look a little different than what it looks right now. And how does that really impact the kind of services that we're able to provide when folks are, you know, quote unquote, going back to normal.
So I'm going to end with this last question for all three of you, and I'll start with you, Detective, in just a minute here. You know, what did I not ask, really? What is something that you want people to know that you think is vital in this situation? Really just kind of giving the last word to all three of you, and I'll start with you, Detective.
What do I want people to know is that we're...
Yeah, I mean something, you know, I have my scope of knowledge here, but you are the ones that are seeing this, dealing with it every day. So is there anything else that you think that you want to just add to this conversation that maybe wasn't mentioned or you want to just expand on? Just trying to get the last word. You know, what do you think?
I mean, just from a detective standpoint, I would love to see the ability to have arrest warrants, particularly for domestic and sexual violence, served like at this point in time, reviewed through the judicial process electronically. I think that would speed things up a little bit. But I understand the huge issues with that. I get that, but that would just be an ideal thing for me. But having seen what Karen and Beth were able to do with the ex parte restraining orders, it gives me kind of hope that maybe down the road we could pursue something like that. So that, right now we submit a piece of paper, an affidavit to court, and it goes through a prosecutor and then through a judge, and it, eventually makes its way back to the police department, which is usually a very fast process for domestic and sexual violence. But right now there's obviously a holdup. So if we would have the ability to submit electronically and have those affidavits reviewed electronically, I think that would help. But again, I understand that that's not something that can just, we can't just start doing that. There's a whole process involved with that. What I would want to express to people that are affected by domestic and sexual violence right now is, our ship is afloat. We're still working, we're still providing services, and we're still here for you. We're all learning this together, and we're doing things for the first time, but we're doing them. And that's what I would want to convey to people.
Okay, thank you. Beth, we can move on over to you. What's something that I missed that you think we need to know?
For me, I guess I'm somebody who can easily get overwhelmed, and this has been a really overwhelming time in terms of, what's happening in our world and what's happening with survivors. And the thing that's been really nice for me is to be able to also take a step back and to reflect on the ways in which we can really think about preventing, violence as we return back to normal. What we have witnessed on a global scale is community-based prevention efforts that have worked, right? We have identified that we were able to collectively come together in response to a pandemic, and social distancing and other things right along with that were really effective strategies for this public health crisis. I would really love, to walk away with folks really being able to be inspired by the possibilities of preventing sexual and domestic violence through shared responsibility and community accountability. I really think that that's one of the things that is a real silver lining, is being able to see this crisis in a way that can propel us forward in our work and think about how we can not only respond to, the violence that's happening in our society, but how can we prevent it from happening at all? So for me, I would echo, we are here, we are in this together. Our services remain available, in terms of all of our member centers are providing those services, our hotlines are operable. But really, I think if folks can lean into hope right now, that really does become, a really positive way to think about something that can come out of this.
Thank you. And Karen?
Yeah, I would echo what both Carrie and Beth mentioned, but also just that added piece that people should know that help is available 24/7. It might look a little different, but the supports are in place. And I think that what this COVID-19 circumstance has brought to us is just how remarkable the advocacy can be. There are really unique ways that advocates are reaching out to and helping survivors, which they've not utilized those skill sets before. And so I think at the end of the day, we're going to be taking a look at these lessons learned. We're actually compiling a lessons learned document that we can review in a few months around this process in terms of what might we be able to do differently? What have we learned about the advocacy world and the work that we're doing? But just the surety that I know there's been a lot of articles very recently around this pandemic and how it can create real implications for victims of sexual and domestic violence. But know that there is hope, there is access to help and resources 24/7. And I also think that the systems that are in place to be providing supports are really working very collaboratively and collectively together in the best interest of survivors. And so just that people should not hesitate to reach out for help because it is available.
And Karen, that's a great point. And if you could all do me a favor after we get off this call, if you'd be able to email me some resources, links, anything that you think would be helpful, we will certainly post those and then have that as a resource for people to a bank of resources for people. So I would appreciate that from all of you. And with that, I'd like to just close again. Beth Hamilton, Deputy Director of the Connecticut Alliance to End Sexual Assault. Karen Jarmock, President and CEO of the Connecticut Coalition Against Domestic Violence, and Carrie Dolling, Detective Carrie Dolling of Fairfield, who works on sex crimes and domestic violence. Really appreciate all your time being on here to talk about this key issue, even if it's not one in the news every day, as we can see, it's going to have an impact for months to come. So we really thank you for spending the time to go through this with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you, and be safe. Take care.
You as well.
Thank you too.